Hello, beautiful people. Let's dive right into a wonderful overview of the book of Ruth. I'm going to go a little quick here. So this book always fascinated me because God was really not even mentioned that much. The storyline goes that there were three main characters, Ruth, Boaz, and Naomi. Well, let's take a look together and see how this wonderful story unfolds. In chapter 1, we find that there was a famine in the land, and so they needed to find better possibilities for food. So they moved to the land called Moab. That's Israel's sworn enemy. In the treachery and the hardship of the move, the father here in the story died and left two sons, and they also died. And whoever was left was the wives. So Ruth had no reason to stay in this land since she wasn't from there. And she said she was leaving. One of the widows' names was Oprah. And then there was Ruth. Naomi tried to convince them to stay there with her. Well, Oprah said, "Hey, look, I'm leaving." Well, Naomi showed great loyalty to Ruth and said she wasn't leaving, and she stayed there with her. And that's where you hear the famous quote that wherever you go, I will go. And your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. So the two of them returned to Israel, and at that time Ruth changed her name to Myra, which means bitterness, well, in bitterness of heart. Chapter 2 begins and starts out where Ruth and Naomi were hungry, and they wanted something to eat, so they had to search out, and it was the beginning of barley harvest. So Ruth went out to the field and started picking from the harvest of the farmer named Boaz, who just so happened to be the relative of Naomi. The description of Boaz is he is a very noble man of character, and he noticed Ruth as being just so loyal. He began to see favor on her, and he was very generous towards her and made special implications to his workers to leave just a little bit extra for her to gather for her provisions. Boaz was so impressed with her loyalty to Naomi that he asked God to bless her. So when Ruth went back to Naomi, she had told her that she met Boaz. She was so excited and said, "Hey, that's my family member. He's my kinsman redeemer." Well, in that culture practice, Israel, it was passed on that the man, when the family member died, and the widow, they took on the widow. And the kinsman's redeemer's responsibilities was to marry the widow, take up her properties, and take care of her and her family, hence the name kinsman redeemer. This is where hope entered Naomi's heart, and that's maybe there was something ahead, possibly for her future, she began to think. Chapter 3 begins with Naomi and Ruth figuring out a plan to get Boaz's attention to notice them. So Ruth decided it was time to stop wearing clothes of a grieving widow and dressed accordingly to a young woman that would be showing signs that she was available to be married. She meets up with Boaz as he's resting in the field, and she startled him and said, "Hey, look, would you consider marrying Naomi and be her kinsman redeemer?" Boaz was amazed. He really was at the loyalty of these two women. He called Ruth a woman of noble character. It's the same noble character mentioned in the Proverbs 31 woman. Boaz tells her yes, and to return as she did. In chapter 3, it ends with Ruth returning to Naomi and reporting this great news that Boaz would marry her. Chapter 4 begins, and it really just brings us all together. Boaz knew of a family member that was closer to Naomi, and it would be his position, however, to marry her. Well, he found out that she was a Moabite, Israel's sworn enemy, and he refused. So Boaz graciously agrees to marry Naomi, and just as the beginning of the story, Ruth and Naomi were loyal, Boaz begins to show his loyalty here. Well, in conclusion, the storyline shows of God's love and his redemption for all. A great word to mention here that really God is not mentioned that much. However, the characters talk about God, and the narrator of the book also mentions God, but Ruth really doesn't mention God. Beautifully written here, showing that even when we can't see God's working things out, he's behind the scenes working on our behalf. And the beginning of the story, Ruth seems as if God was trying to punish her. Well, in all actuality, he was just setting her up to be blessed. God was on a mission to restore her family. God used Ruth's boldness and Boaz's generosity to redeem Naomi. This beautifully written story goes to show how our choices lead to our promises for our future, and that how they do play a major part in our everyday lives, our decisions and choices, that is. God is weaving together here the faithfulness and loyalty to bring about his redemptive purposes in the world. To conclude, the story, it ends up in this book of genealogy, and it shows Boaz and Naomi's son Obed was his name. He was the grandfather of King David, from whom the lineage of Messiah. So, all of a sudden, seemingly these simple, mundane decisions and ordinary choices in this story have woven a beautiful guideline of God's redemption plan for the world. So, see, the book of Ruth invites us to consider that God be at work in our simple decisions and choices in our everyday life. He's making our own redemption story. And that's what the book of Ruth is all about, a story of redemption. Amen. God bless you. I hope you enjoyed this as much as I did. See you next time.